Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. In this video, we will explore how to run Bizagi connector directly from Visual Studio Code without using Bizagi Studio or Work Portal. Before we start, let's first understand the components involved in this setup. The first thing we will create is local connector runner. This will be a custom Node.js script that will allow us to execute connector actions locally. It uses built-in Bizagi router, which is included in every connector package. The local runner is responsible for orchestrating the full connector execution flow, including authentication and connector action execution. Our execution flow will be following. First, the local connector runner will call Bizagi router. Through the router, we will invoke authentication logic. Normally, this is where you will implement your custom authentication logic. In our case, I will simply log message to the console and return dummy authentication token. Once the authentication response is returned, it goes back to the local connector runner, and at this point, we will merge authentication response with connector global auth data object. This is exactly the same thing which will happen in the real connector execution. After that, we invoke connector action and pass both the input data and merge globals. I have implemented a sample connector action, and this action simply returns dummy response. When the connector action finishes execution, the result is passed back to the local connector runner, where response will be formatted and outputted in the JSON format so that we can see it directly in the Visual Studio Code. Now let's take a look at implementation. At the top of local connector runner, I have imported all the required Node.js modules. Then we import Bizagi router. This is a technical file which comes with every connector package and exposes several important functions. In this example, we will use two of them. First, invoke action is responsible for executing specific connector action based on its name. Authenticator, which accepts globals and callback function, this function looks up auth.js file and executes its invoke method. There is one more technical function available, but we won't use it in this example. Next, we need to understand how we pass system configuration and case data without Bizagi Studio and the real case. For this purpose, I have created a sample data file. This file exports two objects. The first object represents the globals or system configuration. One important thing is to note that there is additional property which specifies the connector name or project name. Under the system properties, I have defined typical attributes such as host, timeout, environment, and so on. Under authentication data, I have added dummy API key. The second object represents input data: first name, last name, and case number. These values will be accessible through the globals data attribute. To run everything locally, I will use Visual Studio Code built-in debugger. Debugger configuration is defined in the VS Code folder launch JSON file. Here you can see the standard Node.js debugger setup. The most important part is a program attribute which points to the local connector runner. We also define dynamic argument called file. This argument will contain name of the currently active file. When we will start debugging, VS Code will take active connector action file and pass its name as an argument to the local connector runner. This will allow Bizagi router to identify exactly which connector action should be executed. Once execution starts, we log message indicating that connector is running. We also log start time. Additionally, we use setInterval function to log message every second, just to indicate that the connector is still running. We also define small helper function that logs the final execution time once the connector has finished. In this example, I'm logging execution time in seconds, but you can easily adjust this in milliseconds if needed. Now let's look at execution order. Authentication is always executed before connector action. That's why first we call Bizagi router authenticator function. This function requires three parameters: the global object, the callback function, and Boolean flag indicating if logging is enabled. In our case, we will call authenticator with mocked data and use inline callback function. And of course, we will set logging to true. Inside the callback function, we first check response returned from our auth.js invoke method. In my example, it returns dummy token. If any error would occur, we first would log it into the console. Otherwise, we continue with the next steps. The important part here is to merge authentication output result with the global's auth data object. This will allow connector actions invoke function to access both the system configuration values, which you will specify in a connector system configuration, and the authentication data returned from your auth.js file. In practice, this means that the global's auth data object will contain not only original system configuration attributes, but also additional values such as authentication token. Next, we call Bizagi router invoke action function. This function will look up connector action by its name and execute its invoke method. We pass globals, action name, input data, authentication type, and inline callback function, and of course, we will enable logging. Inside the callback, we first check if execution was successful. Then we format response as a JSON and output it in the console. In addition, we will write result to the local temporary JSON file and open it in the Visual Studio Code, as it will simplify debugging of our connector logic. Now let's run the connector. To do this, we open connector action file, go to the Run menu, and select Start Debugging. If debugger is configured correctly, we should see the result written to new JSON file. Here we can see the output object returned by our sample connector action. This message contains value taken from our sample input data. There are no errors, execution was successful, and the response code is 200. The auto-testing attribute is a technical one, and you can ignore it for now. You can see the same result in the debug console. In addition, you will see detailed connector logs exactly the same way as they would appear in the real connector execution. For example, here we can see output from our auth.js file. As you remember, you can use various logging levels as info, warning, error, and when working with those in the Visual Studio Code, they are really helpful because they will output result highlighted in different colors. Logs also are written in the connector log file following the same format you would see in the Bizagi management console. In conclusion, using a local connector runner, you will get full access to the logs, to the traces, which will really help you to improve your connector logic. One more important feature I want you to show is breakpoints. Breakpoints allow you to pause execution at any point in the code. For example, here execution stops at a breakpoint, and in the Visual Studio Code, you can inspect all variables and their current values, including inputs and globals. This is extremely useful when debugging complex logic and when you have a lot of transformations within your connector code. You can also modify data on the fly. For example, I can change the first name input, save the changes, and resume execution. When connector finishes, you will see that the result contains already modified value instead of the original inputs object value. So thank you for watching. If you found this video useful, please subscribe, hit the like button, and let me know in the comments what other topics I should cover next.